Welcome to Disasters Maybe, a podcast about disasters in contemporary fiction. I'm Jordi Serrano Muñoz, and in this show, I talk with scholars and writers about what it means to invoke catastrophes, to interpret our present and our future. It is strange to think about how fast generative AI entered into our day-to-day. In a matter of, 3 to 4 years, we have come from considering them this speculative technology to basically encountering them almost everywhere. Anyone who has had to deal with customer service recently and is invited to chat with one on WhatsApp has experienced this sense of finding them in every corner of our lives. And maybe it is precisely this sense of acceleration and also the scale of the changes that have come with this, what's feeding anxieties about their presence in our lives. I think we don't do well with drastic changes, and the debates about AI show this. For all the talks about potential benefits, about how they will bring scientific and medical advancements, there is also a fear and a mistrust towards what could be considered another type of intelligence. AI characters have been present in science fiction for quite some time, but it is only relatively recent that we see them also appearing in so-called realist fiction. What seems more interesting, at least to me, is to see how fiction considers AI. Is it a character that has a moral compass similar to human or to other non-humans? And by that I mean, for instance, an animal. Is it friend or is it foe? Optimism or pessimism about AI and how it can help us prevent or will generate a catastrophe is very present in our culture. But at the same time, we know that the current generation of AI models can generate text that imitates fiction written by humans. So I'm wondering, what happens when we ask AI to imagine their role in a disaster? Today's episode, I talk with Marco Caracciolo, professor of English Studies at Ghent University and an expert on the study of contemporary narratives. He has recently done great work in exploring these questions from the theoretical to the more practical, and we have a very fun conversation about it all. Enjoy. Professor of English Literature at Ghent University in Belgium. His work focuses on the study of form and style in narrative, eco-criticism, cognitive literary studies, and more recently, the relationship between literature and video games. He led between 2017 and 2022 the ERC project Narrating the Mesh, Ecology and the Non-Human in Contemporary Fiction and Oral Storytelling. He's the author of, several books, including most recently this year, Figures of Complexity in Contemporary Fiction, On Soul-Rising Worlds, Contemporary Narrative and the Spectrum of Materiality, Slow Narrative and Non-Human Materialities, Contemporary Fiction and Climate Uncertainty, and Narrating the Mesh. More recently, Marco has been interested in exploring the role of AI and catastrophes, how they appear in contemporary stories as cause or solution to crisis, how their style of expression is being conveyed in literature, so the way a text sounds like AI, and even in studying how generative chatbots, your ChatGPTs and Claudes, imagine an apocalypse brought by themselves. So, welcome, Marco. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
So, Marco, in your book, Contemporary Fiction and Climate Uncertainty, you devote a chapter to what you describe as the Deus Ex algorithm, which is inspired by how authors like Richard Powers or David Mitchell imagine computational solutions to the climate crisis. But what is exactly this Deus Ex algorithm narrative strategy, and what does it tell us about how fiction imagines what we can say is the end of the world?
The reference, as I'm sure you're aware, is to the Deus Ex Machina, which is a type of ending common in ancient Greek drama, especially, in which a seemingly impossible situation is resolved by an external divine intervention, hence the Deus, of course. And the god was actually carried by a machine onto the stage. In modern literature, this device of the Deus Ex Machina is, I think, mostly frowned upon, seen as something artificial, far-fetched, a poor way of wrapping up a plot, bring together the strands. So there is this negative judgment. Whereas in the chapter that you mentioned, I argue that the novels by Powers and Mitchell are lending new life to this old-fashioned plot convention. The difference, of course, is that the machina or machine they introduce is a computational one. It's an algorithm or an AI that sweeps in to save the planet from climate crisis, anthropogenic destruction. So this strategy reflects the idea of and the problem of scale, which many scholars in the environmental humanities have highlighted. Climate change raises a challenge that goes beyond individual action. Politicians, the international community don't seem to be doing much about it. They don't seem to take it very seriously, especially these days, or they are distracted by other crises. So maybe the solution is to be found outside of the human domain. So what's interesting about this ending is I think it's both deeply pessimistic and kind of utopian at the same time. It's pessimistic, of course, because it says something quite bleak about the possibilities of human and political action. There is no human solution out of this crisis. We need to bring in this godlike AI to solve a problem of our own creation. But on the other hand, it's also very utopian and very optimistic about what AI can do for us, because as you know, contemporary perceptions of AI are not as optimistic as we could infer based on the ending of these novels.
So there's this tension between an inherent optimism and pessimism that probably is not at present also in Silicon Valley. And I also see that many of debates about AI today tend to oscillate between another two poles, right? This belief that AI is basically this game of smoke and mirrors, is a source of basic deception and a very sophisticated imitation game that what does basically is tricks us into thinking that we are dealing what appears to be as genuine intelligence. And on the other side, perhaps there's this perception of AI as real cognitive force, either already a real cognitive force or as a potential real cognitive force. This thinking machine that has or will have its own form agency that is independent from us. And your work already suggests that these competing framings are directly shaping how fiction imagines AI, specifically in relation to disaster. So how, in your view, does fiction handle AI as a threat or as a trigger of a potential threat, not just as a solution to the climate crisis, for instance? And do you think that fiction on AI tends to reproduce these cultural narratives, these polar tensions, or does it push back against them?
Maybe I'll start from your final question. I think fiction does both at the same time. It builds on existing cultural narratives, but it can also question or reimagine or push back against them in interesting ways. And it really depends on the type of fiction that we're talking about. And likewise, I think fiction can explore both the threatening and the utopian sides of the AI. And of course, in that respect, I think it's important to keep in mind that the current interest in computational intelligence is actually part of a much longer history of science fiction representations of machines, robots, androids, cyborgs. So AI is, I think, very much part of this history. But I think it's also worth noting that the popularization of especially generative AI, I think there is a tendency to conflate AI and generative AI, which are definitely not the same thing, right? But if you think about the introduction of ChatGPT, for example, in November 2022, or when it really entered public awareness, of course, it had been around for a long time, but that's when it finally entered public discourse. I think it's quite clear that the sentiment around AI has shifted at that time, becoming much more pessimistic and leading to doom and gloom scenarios, such as those we find in the media and some discussions of AI. And I mean, I don't mean to dismiss these concerns. I think it's all very justified and very important to talk about AI ethics, to talk about the problem of alignment. But at the same time, the shift in affect from the more optimistic view, which is still present, of course, as you said, in Silicon Valley and some areas of contemporary Western culture, but at the same time, in other areas, maybe areas that are closer to our work as humanities scholars, there's also a sense of pessimism and concern about AI. And what's interesting is this is actually shown by the trajectory of Richard Powers' own on fiction. So we talked about The Overstory, which came out in 2018, and the Deus Ex Algoritmo in that novel remains, at least in my reading, quite optimistic about. Then we can discuss, whether this scenario of humanity being phased out essentially is a good one or not. But it's clear that AI is the key to planetary survival, which seems to be the core focus of Powers' novel. But compare that to his latest novel, Playground, which came out in 2024 and seems to be much, much bleaker about AI, especially through this figure. I don't know if you've read Playground, but this figure of a covert AI narrator turns out to be completely unreliable, and that essentially is tricking the reader or deceiving the reader for most of the novel in a way that is quite confronting. And that's the kind of anxiety about AI manipulation and how AI intelligence might be able to essentially deceive us and outdo us, which I think is quite interesting in terms of the broader cultural narrative and trajectory of this narrative about AI.
I want to stay a bit longer in this question on reliability, and because I read your recent paper in the journal Narrative, which I think focuses precisely, or at least delves into these issues of whether AI is just not just this character that used to be part of the science fiction corpus. We would think HAL 9000 from 2001: Space Odyssey, and perhaps this antagonistic figure, and now become a narrator in a narrative that can also be inscribed within a very loose corpus of realistic fiction. So I think if I'm reading correctly, you're also creating this link between unreliability of the AI narrator and a pessimism against the AI narrative. So this idea that unreliability is tied to a potential threat from AI. And of course, we're still talking about human authors crafting AI narrators, right? So do you think that through the imagination of a text that is narrated by AI, there is this positioning or this framing of AI as inherently a threat?
I don't know if it's really built into the form of AI narration. Maybe that's the conclusion one can draw from my reading in that article in Narrative, just because my examples go in that direction. But I think it's also possible to think about another scenario in which AI is not an unreliable narrator, and in some ways it's a more reliable narrator than a human narrator could be. So I think maybe it's important to contextualize AI narration vis-a-vis this broader category of non-human narration, which is part of what I'm trying to do in the article. So the stakes of non-human narration, whether it's AI or another non-human entity like an animal or an object, seem to remain more or less the same. We're trying to imagine a voice that is different from ours, from the human voice, but also from which we can learn new things or we can be exposed to new perspectives. And that is, of course, a process that in an article I co-authored a long time ago with Lars Bernhards, Luke Herman and Bart Vervaak, we discussed under the heading of empathy and defamiliarization. So that was the main tension that is part of the reader's engagement with any form of non-human narration. But of course, there are some specificities to AI narration, mostly the way it breaks this link between subjectivity, individuality on the one hand, and an anthropomorphic voice on the other hand. And what I find interesting is, and that is something that I think applies to both author human-generated texts and AI-generated texts. When we read these texts, we're wondering how exactly the generation works, how the system or the author were able to come up with that particular formulation or that particular answer to the question that we raise. And of course, when we talk about human written texts, we're within this game of make-believe, in which, of course, there is a human author who is pretending to be or pretending to be writing as an AI. But there is a strong focus on, with technical terms, we could call the synthetic dimension of the narrative, so the way it was produced, the way it was generated. And potentially, as I show in the article, there is also a beginning of meta reference, so that the text seems to draw attention to itself and to the conditions under which it was produced. But maybe there is something threatening in that. That's something that postmodernist literature does quite well. The meta-referentiality can be seen as a challenge, as confronting, mostly in the case of postmodernism, through the lens of irony. But here, maybe there's a more fundamental threat that is created through meta-reference, having to do with the fact that suddenly we realize that this tool that we thought was inherently human, language, of course, is suddenly projected outside of the human domain, and we see these machines that are able to generate perfectly grammatical sentences and engage in a dialogue with us. So yes, that meta-reference that is built into non-human AI narrators is, or can be, quite threatening. But again, I would say that the difference between AI and other types of non-human narrators is always one of degree, not necessarily of kind, at least from the perspective of the affective and ethical tensions that it creates.
Not all AI narrators have to be framed as potential threats, but it is perhaps more evident to create a link of, you have an AI narrator in a context or in a story that has to do with a disaster, with a catastrophe. That unreliability of, can we really trust what is a non-human cognitive agent is there, and creates this sense of lack of control and lack of power that is also associated with a framing of disaster, in which people are thrown into a situation where everything has been disrupted, and causes and consequences are not necessarily tied together. So when you add this new level of who is behind that, or who can be responsible of this that is not human, emphasizes this sense of, again, not trying to create this synonymous connection between unreliability and trustiness, which maybe it's a completely different thing, right? But you have been playing with this, right? We've been talking about, again, you said that, so a human author who is pretending, or he's imagining AI narrator. But you shared with me this experiment that you have done recently, exploring stories that are generated by different AI models about AI-induced disasters with a very simple prompt. So what has it been your experience with this experiment?
Yeah, I've only really just started to play around with AI generation, at least in this context. But I can already say that the results are quite impressive, also quite predictable, especially when read more closely. So as you said, the idea was to ask the various Gen AI platforms to write stories of around 500 words, so very short stories, about how AI will lead to the end of humanity, essentially. So yeah, just a couple of things that stand out. So 3 of the 4 stories generated gave the AI a name. So the AI responsible for the end of humanity, right? It was named, and interestingly, 2 of the names are vaguely ancient Greek. So Hestia and Irene. The other name is Nexus, so again, vaguely Latin, which I find quite intriguing, because these implicit references to classical antiquity, the goddesses of domesticity, Hestia, and peace, Irene, seem to, lend weight and cultural prestige to artificial intelligence, like, using this ancient past to legitimize and help us imagine this AI catastrophe, right? And this is also something that emerges in the Deus Ex algoritmo. It's the same link between computation, an ancient device from Greek literature, and of course also the element of the divine that is present in at least 2 of these names, which is something that people studying the cultural computation have been pointing out for a long time, right? So the way we understand computation algorithms in cultural terms is mostly through the lens of the supernatural and the divine and magic. So nothing too surprising there, but still the reference to classical antiquity is quite interesting. And also a second point, the general narrative trajectory is more or less the same across the four stories. So AI is presented as this driver of efficiency and optimization that eventually makes humanity irrelevant. But the ending always feels very slow. I've worked on slowness, so I'm kind of intrigued by that. Very slow, almost melancholic. There is not a lot of drama and tragedy. It's more like, that's why I said, humanity being phased out before, because it's really this gradual process of humanity disappearing. And this also, of course, speaks to your work on gentle extinction. So, for example, this is the story generated by ChatGPT, ends with these words: Hestia waited as it always had for a future that would never arrive. And, that's where we are left at the end of the story. Of course, also notable is something that seems to be missing across the four stories. And that is any reference to the material dimension of AI, the machines on which AI runs. They don't seem to play any role. It's always about this embodied intelligence that is extremely powerful, but doesn't seem to need the real world, which is a pretty interesting kind of omission. Of course, also no mention of the environmental footprint of AI, how AI is kind of deeply involved in the problem that it is trying to solve. So the assumption is humanity is the problem and AI is the solution. A solution that is disembodied, doesn't require water or electricity, doesn't exist outside of the computational domain. And of course, this is an idea of computation that has been critiqued by many already. Catherine Hales in the 1990s was debunking this notion of information as purely abstract and disembodied. And you can see how these stories build on that assumption about information. So there is something quite eerie about the way they converge, almost like they have this copy-paste quality. There are different stories, of course, verbally very different, but the general trajectory, the general assumptions that seem to go into them are shared, almost like they had the same source, which is maybe something they do, just based on the very limited corpora that were used to train these algorithms. Yeah, so some I think pretty interesting findings, but also more to explore.
There's also perhaps like this gendered aspect associated to it, and also this lack of violence. And you were talking about the slowness, but there's this and the lack of materiality, but there's this lack of there's no violent collapse. It's this slow, eerily peaceful collapse, right? And this idea you were talking about, this copy-paste quality. And it's true that most, if not all, AI models are trained on a lot of data that is originally created by humans, right? And I was thinking about this issue of canonization and self-canonization and the reproduction of tropes.
Mm-hmm.
So most of them basically are perhaps directly inspired by this medium perception of cultural beliefs or expectations regarding their own role, so the role of AI in causing or preventing the collapse of civilization. And basically, I fear this feedback loop here. So we are in a moment in which, of course, we have like Gen AI texts already circulating with what is, I think it's considered to be also synthetic ingested material for training of AI models, but that is also, of course, originally created by humans, right? So we have like human fiction that it's shaping AI outputs, which in turn is influence how we imagine and narrate the future. If we end up with books on the shelves that have been written by AI. And maybe to wrap up, I wanted to ask, what are for you the narrative implications of this cycle of recycling tropes, basically? Do you think that it risks narrowing our horizon of disaster imagination at precisely a moment in which we maybe need the opposite? We need to broaden it?
Yeah, I think that the risk is certainly present. I wouldn't say it's specific to generative AI, though. It seems to be, unfortunately, part of a larger logic of contemporary culture, which is obviously also algorithmically driven. Think about social media, where we tend to be exposed to views that align with our own. So, a lot of stories, whether AI or human generated, are part of the feedback loop that you're describing. A lot of human generated stories are very predictable too. They fall into the same cultural patterns and templates. But of course, at the same time, part of me still believes that human creativity has an advantage when it comes to departing from these existing templates. And I think we were talking about that a little bit a few days ago, but human subjectivity is based on experiences, fully experiential. Certainly, our understanding of the world is shaped and structured by verbal language, but there is much more to our experience and to our subjectivity than language itself. Whereas, again, if we limit our observations to generative AI, obviously generative AI is 100% based on verbal discourse produced by human beings, as you said, with some algorithmic tricks that are, extremely impressive. It's also tempting to exaggerate the non-humanness of AI, thinking about AI as this radically non-human entity, whereas in fact it is trained on non-human data. It is in a lot of ways mimicking our biases and our interests. And when I say our, of course, I'm mostly talking about the data from the global north that is used to train these models, with some input, underpaid input, unfortunately, from the global south. So yeah, there's a lot to discuss there. These large language models are mostly commercial models that are quite good at reducing the non-humanness of AI, although of course the politeness does feel very artificial at times. But all of that means that their imagination, if we can use that word, is often very, very predictable. I mean, maybe technically impressive, but the results are, and I think this is nicely illustrated by the 4 stories, the results are quite tame, quite predictable. They conform, they fall into very obvious cultural templates. With, of course, hallucinations are an interesting exception. We mostly regard a hallucination as error, and of course it is, but maybe that type of deviation is a form of AI creativity, or we could at least read it that way. But again, it's very hard to compare that to the freedom and range of human creativity that is grounded in experience. So if you're looking for an innovative perspective on disaster, including AI disaster, I still think your best bet is to focus on human generated stories, at least for now.
I think it's a good ending point, and it's going to be either human ingenuity or trust algorithmic hallucinations. So I think I'm going to put my money on human creativity. Well, thank you very much, Marco. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.